on here. Great to see my whole lab from many different countries online too. And really great to have Eric Ash as our guest speaker today. Eric's coming in from Canada, but he's actually a PhD student at University of Oxford in the Department of Zoology. And he's part of a very well-renowned group called Wild Crew, which is the Wildlife Conservation Research Unit at Oxford. It's run by a friend of mine, David McDonald, and they are well known for collecting probably more data than anyone else on the Asia's most endangered predators. And they work on a variety of different species. And Eric fits really well into that because he's been working on tigers in Thailand for a number of years. And he has, I think, been in the field almost at the same time of me in Khao Yai in 2018, if I put this timeline correctly together. Is that correct, Eric?
Close. I was out of Thailand in 2017. Otherwise,
Okay.
we may have crossed paths.
Okay, yeah. And so I was really excited to see that he has a recent paper out that looks at assessing the covariates of tiger densities in Thailand using camera trap data, similar to stuff that I do, but he takes a different spin on it and found really cool results. And I thought it'd be a great opportunity to have him give a talk to our group. There's a lot of us that work on predators, a lot of us that think about conservation at very large scales. And so with that, I will hand it over to Eric and say welcome and thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt. I don't think I could have done a better introduction, so thank you. You did most of the work for me there. I suppose I will start sharing my screen to get the presentation started. Hopefully everything works. Can everyone see the PowerPoint?
Yeah, it's good. We can see.
Great. So firstly, thank you for the opportunity to speak here today, especially to Matt, who extended the invitation. I was very impressed with the quality of the CBCS seminars that I saw online. So I can only hope today that my talk is half as good. There's big shoes to fill, given Matt's introduction. My name is Eric Ash. I'm a postgraduate DPhil student with the University of Oxford's Wildlife Conservation Research Unit, or Wild Crew, under the Department of Zoology. I'm currently finishing up the third year of my program, and I hope that I will be submitting my dissertation within the next 6 months. My research focuses on a population of tigers in Eastern Thailand. I worked in Thailand for about 6 years researching tigers with an NGO called Freeland Foundation. During that time, I collated long-term camera trapping data on a population of tigers that was quite poorly understood. So there was an opportunity to summarize and analyze these data to better understand the population, understand its ecology, and contribute insight that could be valuable for, importantly, developing management and conservation strategies. So this became the ultimate goal of my DPhil. I've currently published 4 chapters of my thesis with a 5th in review, and another chapter I'll be finishing and submitting in the next few months. And I'll provide some information on that later in the presentation. So I suspect you already know this, given many of you are carnivore researchers and are familiar with tigers, that you'd think, given how popular the tiger is, we would know everything there is to know about tigers by this point, but it's really far from the case. Back in 2008, I was doing a year abroad program for my undergrad, and through mutual contact, I found myself on the phone with a stranger who would later become my boss, and he was telling me about a population of tigers in Eastern Thailand that people weren't really paying attention to. I had heard of it, but most of the literature on tigers in Thailand were from Western Thailand. If you were a tiger researcher, that's where you were working. He was really trying to sell me on this population, saying people don't really know what's there, more work needs to be done to find out. And I, like many people, wasn't really paying that much attention. I was a bit skeptical, but that year we had started camera trapping, and our results would change my perspective on tigers in general and have implications for tiger conservation in Southeast Asia. It's a take message here that I think even with tigers, if you look, you can be surprised at what you find. So during my presentation, I want to do 2 things. The first thing I want to do is highlight the general research results from my landscape in Eastern Thailand in the context of their conservation regionally. And second, I want to provide a case study on a paper I recently published in the journal Animal Conservation specifically the study that provides insights on how one can examine which factors among prey, human, and environmental characteristics best explain the patterns that we saw of tiger presence using opportunistic camera trap data. So we're all aware that tigers are under tremendous threat. That's probably news to no one. Over the past 100 years, they've lost an estimated 93% in habitat, and their populations declined by 96% to an estimated 3,900 individuals. Habitat loss has been especially problematic in South and Southeast Asia, with a 41% reduction in about a 10-year period from 1996 to 2006, and an estimated forest loss of roughly 70,000 kilometers in square kilometers in priority tiger conservation landscapes since the start of the century. So despite being a conservation focus, tigers are still very much in dire straits. And this is especially true in Southeast Asia, which is home to a subspecies of tiger called the Indo-Chinese tiger. Now, in terms of representation in literature, it's one of the least understood subspecies of tiger and may now be one of the most endangered. As you may be aware, tiger taxonomy may change in the future, but for now, I'll refer to the subspecies with the current taxonomic designations under the IUCN Red List. So the subspecies was once found throughout mainland Southeast Asia. In 2011, an assessment under the IUCN Red List estimated the wild population to be approximately 350 individuals in Cambodia, southern China, Laos, Vietnam, Myanmar, and Thailand. However, evidence is now mounting that tigers have naturally across their former range. This is the current range map from the IUCN Red List. And despite previous evidence of a viable breeding population in Namut Pului in Laos, recent evidence suggests that tigers have been extirpated from the country. Tigers were declared extinct in Cambodia by the government a few years ago, prompting plans for reintroduction. And in Vietnam, there's been no confirmed records for almost 30 years. So there's a lack of reliable population data in current range countries. There's quite a bit of uncertainty in to remaining populations, but we know that tigers are in trouble in Southeast Asia. With this information, I think this current range map likely looks closer to the real situation, leaving two countries, Myanmar and Thailand, and a population that may number 200 or fewer individuals. It's possible that the subspecies may qualify for critically endangered status under the IUCN Red List. So Thailand's now extremely important for tigers in Southeast Asia. It's critical for us to better understand where tigers occur and what factors dictate their presence, such as prey, threats, and other factors as well. Thailand's extremely important, but there's been a concerning downward trend in where populations occur. In Thailand's first Tiger Action Plan in 2004, no population estimate was given, but tigers were believed to occur in 15 metapopulations. In their next action plan in 2010, they gave a range of about 190 to 250 individuals in 10 metapopulations. And then a more recent updated government report suggested tigers now occur in approximately 4 metapopulations with population range of 101 to 128, and potentially more individuals. So it's possible only 2 viable populations of tigers remain in the country, one located in Western Thailand, which I mentioned earlier, and the other one in the Dong Phayayen-Khao Forest Complex in Eastern Thailand, which you see in the red box there. So the Dong Phayayen-Khao Forest Complex, which I'll call DPKY, it's a landscape of 5 protected areas. Matt mentioned earlier Khao Yai National Park, which is in the west. You also have Taplan National Park, Pangsita, Taparian National Parks, Dong Yai Wildlife Sanctuary as well. It spans about 6,000 square kilometers. It's about 2 to 3 hours drive from Bangkok, and it's near the Cambodian border. And in 2005, it was designated as the World Heritage Site by UNESCO for its outstanding universal value. Information about tigers in this landscape, especially recently, is quite sparse. There's been a handful of studies from 1997 and 2007 focusing on Khao Yai. These studies likely documented the decline of tigers, and in later studies, it's believed that tigers were extirpated from this park. So prior to the research, there had been no real complex-wide assessments in which tigers were the focal species of interest across the entire area. There's generally very little research interest in, after the extirpation of tigers from Khao Yai, potentially related to that decline. And so that's one of the issues I wanted to address in my work. Starting in 2008, Freeland Foundation, in partnership with the Thai government, conducted camera trap surveys in DPKY, covering all 5 PAs in the complex by 2017. The main objectives were to improve understanding about where tigers occur, their prey species, threats, identify areas of conservation priority. Cameras were deployed opportunistically, prioritizing areas that were likely to support tigers. And as resources improved, we were able to expand the survey as well, also maintaining long-term monitoring in priority areas. And so this resulted in coverage of all 5 PAs and a large data set of tigers, prey, threats, and other species of conservation significance. Now for a quick basic summary of our results, we had cameras for almost 80,000 trap nights. We documented over 1,700 detections of tigers, and this included 16 to 17 adults, 7 males, 7 females, and 2 to 3 of unknown sex. That's increased since we concluded that section of the survey. The surveys are still ongoing. Perhaps the most important result was that our surveys recorded successful breeding. We documented tiger cubs in 2015 and 2016, 6 of them in total from 4 litters. And among these cubs, at least 5 reached dispersal age of about 24 months. And by the end of the study period, in fact, one of those cubs has now raised 3 of her own cubs to dispersal age, which you see in the video there, which is actually pretty incredible for a first-time mom. Another interesting result is that we've generally had low turnover of individuals across the study period, which can be quite unusual for tigers. There was 5 individuals we detected over a period of 8 to 10 of the survey years, 6 individuals over 3 to 5, and another 6 were documented in 1 year each. We continued seeing the same individuals across unusually long periods of time compared to other areas, and it reinforced other evidence that poaching of tigers, at least at that time, was either low or non-existent, which was a positive development. We documented 6 prey species: sambar, wild boar, gaur, muntjac, Chinese arrow, and banteng. We considered these potential prey based on existing literature from Thailand. All but 1 potential prey species, specifically banteng, were documented in all 5 PAs. And we're contributing this information to other assessments of those species, including banteng, which is endangered and losing ground as well. So we had a lot of valuable bycatch from this data. So the most important result as before is that our records prove that this is a breeding site for tigers, which would make it one of the few remaining breeding populations for Indo-Chinese tigers anywhere in the world, which obviously establishes it as a population of regional and global conservation significance. Now, with all this data, I wanted to investigate the explanatory power of prey and human presence and potentially environmental factors on the patterns of tiger detection that we observed in this site. And this is a study that was recently published in Animal Conservation, and I'll spend the rest of the presentation focusing on this. Now, for those who study tigers and large carnivores, you'll know that prey is a critical factor in the presence and persistence of tigers throughout their range. A number of studies throughout the tiger's range indicate a preference for large prey, such as sambar or gaur, species that are above 175 kilograms. There's an influential paper by Carenta et al., I'm sure you've seen it, that directly drew the link between prey density and tiger density. So it's really important to understand. From the camera trap data, we observed a heterogeneity in tiger presence in DPKY, differences in different parks. And so we observed that this might be associated with differences in the presence of prey overall, or specific prey species. In addition, studies from elsewhere suggest that human activities are quite influential on the presence of tigers and the persistence of tigers. So there was a long-term study in the Russian Far East by Kirli et al. That in 2002 that found that the presence of roads, for example, reduced cub survivorship. So during our surveys, we recorded considerable human presence both along the park peripheries and also deep within the parks. And it's possible that this is introducing varying degrees of direct and indirect disturbance. So these are factors that we wanted to investigate, given the evidence from previous studies, understanding the kinds of patterns that would be an important part of developing comprehensive and informed protection strategies for tigers in this landscape. So for this chapter, I opted to use variance partitioning with generalized linear models to help me evaluate the degree to which prey species, human presence, and environmental factors explain these patterns of tiger presence in DPKY, and which among these factors best explains these patterns both independently and confounded with other factors. I predicted that tigers would have strong positive associations with large-bodied prey species such as sambar deer and gaur, given the evidence of the literature and a preference for large prey. They would have strong negative associations with human habitation, to a lesser degree human presence in general. And then finally, I predicted that prey would better explain patterns of tiger detection than human or environmental factors. So in order to develop these models, I compiled a set of covariates for both prey and humans. For prey, I included detection rates, or PCR, for 4 prey species, which were sambar, wild boar, gaur, and muntjac, separate covariates. I didn't include serau or banteng, which I mentioned earlier, as separate covariates due to low sample size, but I also included a combined prey covariate, which was the count of prey species represented at each station, which included serau and banteng, in addition to the other 4 prey species. And so in effect, this was a measure of prey species richness, if you will. Next, for human covariates, I included 9 covariates in total: poachers, domestic dogs, park rangers, vehicles, other humans, as well as distance to roads, distance to settlements, population density, and distance to park substations. And so for roads specifically, I classified roads into 2 classes: uncontrolled public roads, most of which occur outside the parks, and private roads, which are managed by the parks to control access, so for tourism or for ranger access. To model the influence of these covariates, I developed 2 models: a prey model and a human presence model. And for each, I compiled the variables, in this case for prey and humans separately, reducing the variables through filtering steps. So for each covariate, I developed a univariate model with the covariate as the explanatory variable and binomial tiger detections as the response. From this, I filtered variables, conducting Pearson's correlation tests for paired variables that had a correlation coefficient greater than 0.6. I retained the variable with the lowest AICC value. And I also required that variables had a p-value lower than 0.05. If it had a p-value greater than that, I didn't include it in the final models. Now, the remaining variables for prey and human presence were included in their own multivariate GLMs with camera effort as fixed effects and binomial tiger detections as the response. And I also developed an environmental model, which I developed in another paper, from testing and filtering 47 environmental variables such as elevation, forest type, forest cover, etc. The model used a multi-scale and shape optimized approach, where covariates were included at their optimal spatial scale from 250 meters to 16 kilometers. And they were also included in their optimal functional relationship with the binomial tiger detections, which included linear, quadratic, logarithmic, exponential, and negative exponential forms. And so these optimal scales and functional shapes were determined by lowest AICC values of univariate models, and similar filtering steps were conducted on these. So these were included in a multivariate GLM with binomial tiger detections as the response variable as well. To investigate differences in model performance, we evaluated models using 3 steps. The first is we were fortunate enough to utilize a series of R functions called biostats by a fellow named Kevin McGarrigle. We used biostats for all the multivariate GLMs. It allowed us to model all combinations of predictor variables, subsetting for the best performing models, which we defined as those with delta AICC less than 2. The functions then averaged a final set of models and calculated goodness of fit statistics such as sensitivity, specificity, AUC. Then it ranked importance of variables in the final model with averaged coefficients based on Akaiuki's model weights. In the case of the environmental model, it allowed us to include quadratic terms, which was not something that was possible with a function like dredge, for example. Second, we tested the influence of each individual variable on model performance by calculating the difference in probability of tiger detections when the variable increases from the 10th to 100th percentile, using standardized variables and holding all other variables constant at their medians. So we used all the final variables in each group to conduct variance partitioning analysis. So variance partitioning was first introduced by Bocard et al. In 1992 and was later improved by Perez and Edo et al. 2006. Variance partitioning is a kind of regression analysis that could be used to discern the explanatory ability of models on a shared response, both independently and confounded with each other. So an example of visualization can be found on the right, where you have a summary of the variance of your response data, and A represents the variation explained by one set of explanatory variables. C represents variation explained by another. B represents a variation explained by both A and C. And D represents the residual variance. And so the shared partitions are not interactive terms per se, and they can't be given a significance value like what you might get in ANOVA. However, they're useful for explicitly quantifying the amount of variance explained among confounding models for the purposes of investigating differences in explained variance among sets of factors. So in our case, these were prey, human, and environmental factors. And others like Cushman and McGarrick al. 2002 have done more advanced hierarchical variance partitioning to evaluate more complex relationships. But in this study, our approach was fairly simple. And for our study, we conducted variance partitioning using the function varpart within the package vegan in R. Specifically, we included the three described types of covariates, prey, human, and environment, with camera effort as a fourth explanatory component and binomial tiger detections as the single response. And so this would produce a summary of variance explained by these factors, including a Venn diagram like what you see there for visualization. So for our results, I'll summarize by describing the models individually before explaining the results for the variance partitioning. For the prey model, one prey covariate was dropped. That was Muntjac due to P being greater than 5 or 0.5. Pearson's correlation test for variables didn't really indicate any strong correlation between the remaining covariates, so the rest were included. These were 4 prey covariates in the fully averaged model together with camera effort. AICC variable importance was highest for wild boar, prey richness, and camera effort. They were both present in 3 model subsets and lowest for Sambar and Gower at 1. For variable importance, determined by standardized coefficients, this was highest for camera effort, followed by prey richness and wild boar. Both Gower and Sambar had adjusted standard errors crossing 0, so their relationship couldn't be determined. Wild boar appeared to be the strong predictor of tiger presence, with predicted probability increasing linearly by 0.51 as detection rates increased from the 10th to 100th percentiles. Predicted tiger presence was also positively associated with overall prey species richness, increasing by 0.24 as prey richness increased from 0 to 5 prey species detected. For the human model, a total of 6 human covariates were included in the fully averaged model, and they were vehicles, camera effort, distance to park roads, distance to public roads, poacher, detection rates, and settlement density. AICC variable importance varied marginally across the covariates, with the highest values for camera effort, distance to public roads, and settlement density at 3 model subsets, followed by vehicles and distance to park roads at 2, and poacher presence at 1. Influential covariates positively associated with tiger presence included camera effort, distance to public roads. Conversely, covariates with a notably strong negative association included settlement density and to a lesser degree poacher PCRI. Predicted tiger presence relative to change in covariate values was positively associated with vehicles, increasing by 0.75 as vehicles increased from the 10th to 100th percentiles. Tigers were also positively associated with distance to public roads, with probabilities increasing by 0.67 as distance to public roads increased from about 500 meters to 17 kilometers. The changes in predicted tiger presence were generally less pronounced in cases where tigers were negatively associated with covariates. So predicted presence with increasing settlement density, for example, decreased by 0.19 from the 10th to 100th percentiles, and predicted tiger presence steeply declined from 0.12 as poacher PCRI increased. So as I discussed in one of my other papers, which is currently in press, the environmental model describes positive associations with tigers and covariates such as percentage of bamboo forest within 16 kilometers, moderate topographic heterogeneity, such as standard deviation, focal mean of terrain roughness index within a 16-kilometer window, and reforested areas within an 8-kilometer window. The model also described negative associations with secondary forest at 4 kilometers and open forest at 16 kilometers. And overall, the relationships in the model tended to be at very broad scales. The environmental model had some degree of variation in AICC variable importance, ranging from 1 for standard deviation of elevation, correlation length of reforested areas, and percentage of open forest, to 3 for camera effort and correlation length of secondary forest. So the variables with the strongest effect on the probability of tiger presence included bamboo forest, increasing by 0.55 as values increased from the 10th to 100th percentiles, Standard deviation of elevation increased by 0.13 at intermediate values, and there was a sharp decline in probability of presence by 0.58 as percentage of open forest increased. Now, model performance by area under the ROC curve, or AUC, was highest for the environmental model at 0.93, followed by the human model at 0.9 and the prey model at 0.8. In general, these values represent fairly strong ability to discriminate between detection and non-detection points, though the environmental model performed the best based on that metric. Variance partitioning indicated that the environmental model, especially confounded with the human model, accounted for the most relative variance, and specifically, the environmental model independently accounted for approximately 19.6% of relative variance, which was the highest among independent models. And confounded with the human model, the environmental model accounted for over 31% of the variance, which was the highest among confounded models. And so surprisingly, the prey model didn't account for a large amount of the variance compared to other models, accounting for only about 3.1% independently. So let's interpret these results. Our first hypothesis predicted that tigers would have strong positive associations with large-bodied prey species, in particular sambar and gaur. This wasn't the case in our results. In our study, tiger presence had strong positive associations with wild boar, considered in our study medium-sized prey species, while positive or negative relationships couldn't really be determined for sambar and gaur. I found this quite surprising. There was a paper by Hayward et al. That suggested that tigers tended to select prey with a similar body mass to tigers, so a 1-to-1 size ratio, which is consistent with optimal foraging theory. And sambar are, in particular, are a bit closer to that optimal size, and though wild boar can approach a 1-to-1 body size ratio with tigers in our landscape, potentially. Other studies found tigers had strong overall associations with wild boar. In Western Thailand, wild boar were one of the species that had strong associations with tigers. Wild boar and deer species in general, such as sambar, are suggested to be important prey species elsewhere in the tiger's range. For the purposes of testing hypotheses, I used similar designations in other studies in Thailand, which considered sambar and gaur to be large prey species. And these designations were mostly arbitrary, but during the review process for the paper, it seemed like there might have been a better approach to test hypotheses based on the proximity of prey size to Hayward et al.'s 1-to-1 tiger prey body size ratio, but that's a lesson learned, I suppose. Our results may have been influenced by the fact that, as you can compare with the detection rates of the two prey species, wild boar and sambar, wild boar are relatively widespread compared to sambar, and the differences in the availability of these prey species across the complex may have been a factor in the strength of the variable coefficients for these species. It's possible that tigers select sambar when they're available, but given that wild boar are more widespread, this might underpin the survival of tigers in the complex overall. In general, it's important to note that this is not a dietary study. We were limited in the sense that we could only look at general associations. You would need to conduct a dedicated dietary study in order to ascertain more fine-scale patterns of prey selection or prey preferences. So we're very careful with our language there. In addition to the strong positive associations with wild boar, we also documented relatively strong positive associations with overall prey richness. The availability of diverse prey of different size classes is thought to be an important factor in the persistence of large felids in general and large carnivores in general. So it's possible that prey species richness, in addition to specific prey species like wild boar, augments tiger presence in certain areas in DPKY. Our second hypothesis predicted that tigers would have strong negative associations with human habitation and to a lesser degree human presence. And so our results were generally consistent with this hypothesis. Tiger presence in our study had strong negative associations with public roads and settlement density, and relatively strong negative associations with poacher presence. And these results are generally consistent with studies elsewhere, suggesting broad negative associations with human activity overall. You tend to find strong negative associations with settlements and public roads in studies elsewhere in the tiger's range. This appears to be almost universal, and although they're seemingly intuitive results, they're nonetheless important to quantify. You may have different complex patterns of relationships with human presence that are site-specific, so it is important to examine. Our results do depart somewhat from our hypothesis with positive associations with park roads and vehicles. In our study, we distinguished between public roads primarily occurring outside park boundaries and park roads maintained by PAs, which facilitate access for patrolling and in some cases tourism. So some of the tiger hotspots in the complex are accessible by park roads, which are used by rangers for patrol access. And this may overlap with areas of conservation priority. Tigers may use some of these roads to move through the landscape, which may explain this association. So in the original surveys, we didn't survey a full extent to the park roads, such as more controlled ranger-only access roads versus tourist roads. I suspect if we had sampled roads more equally, the association with vehicles might have been different. And it's possible we could have seen interesting thresholds for vehicle activity past which tigers avoid certain roads, but unfortunately we weren't able to do that. Ideally, you want a more dedicated, systematic study to investigate those fine scale patterns. Our third hypothesis was that prey itself would better explain tiger presence compared to human presence and environmental characteristics, given the established importance of prey as a major limiting factor in tiger presence. It surprised me that this wasn't really reflected in our results. It's important to note that, firstly, a lack of prey would certainly preclude tiger presence, as in the case of empty forests, like in Laos, for example. But in this study, we're interested in how factors like prey explain variance in our results relative to other factors. So in terms of relative variance explained, variance partitioning indicated that prey alone explained less variance compared to other factors. Variance partitioning indicated that our environmental model explained the greatest overall proportion of variance, particularly confounded with human factors. So the variance partitioning in our study indicated that tiger relationships with prey in some cases could be explained by a combination of environmental and human factors, depending on how you develop those models. And I think this partially has to do with the development of the environmental model specifically. The environmental model mentioned before describes strong positive associations with habitat suitable for important prey species described in our study. So bamboo forest, for example, which might have benefits for prey. It also describes strong negative associations with strong positive associations with core habitat away from human habitation, strong negative associations with habitat near settlements that were heavily impacted by human activities, such as open forest at large scales. So in effect, the covariates in the environmental model, including certain prey habitat and terrain away from settlements, may have served as a sort of proxy of prey and human associations. So together with other environmental covariates, this model may have been a more comprehensive predictor of tiger presence overall than prey or human factors on their own, resulting in a higher explanatory performance. And so it suggests that in some cases, an environmental model coupled with anthropogenic factors could be used to model tiger occurrence where other data may be lacking, but I would stress a high degree of caution, since regardless of environmental characteristics, poaching and prey depletion can eradicate tigers and species from otherwise intact habitat. The large amount of variance explained was when the environmental and human factors were confounded. And this might have to do with the fact that in DPKY, mountainous habitat has been the least prone to disturbance historically, with elevation, for example, limiting patterns of human influence. Much of the lowland forest in Thailand was converted to agriculture, and mountainous areas were typically more difficult to settle, so these often became protected areas by default, given that little forested habitat remained outside these areas. So this may have been a reason why there's so much variance explained by the confounded and human models. So ultimately, the results were surprising. The explanatory factors we tested for tiger presence turned out to be a bit more nuanced than initially hypothesized. Partitioning the variance between these confounding models helped us understand this a little bit better. In general, in the paper, we suggest that tiger presence in DPKY is dictated to a great extent by habitat far from human disturbance, the presence of key prey species like wild boar as well. And given the patterns of tiger presence in our study and consistent with studies elsewhere, we recommended prioritizing protection of this key central habitat, minimizing human presence, and securing these prey-rich areas as a part of ongoing tiger protection strategies in the site. And I think this is a particularly important precedent to set. These kinds of recommendations are pretty standard for managing tiger populations in general, but large-scale assessments in DPKY have been lacking. So there wasn't strong evidence of these kinds of patterns in the literature, at least for DPKY. So for the key points and takeaways, while the data couldn't, at least this specific data couldn't be included in more rigorous analytical studies like occupancy or capture-recapture analysis, that kind of opportunistic data from these surveys was helpful in a few ways. The first, as I described previously, this approach helped us to identify these kinds of nuanced relationships with prey and human and environmental factors using variance partitioning, which can also inform future model development and future studies. Second, the initial work that we did in the early part of our surveys helped increase the investment in the site, leading to more rigorous studies. So at the start of our study, tigers were thought to have disappeared from Phayayen National Park. Information was lacking in other areas. For all intents and purposes, there wasn't really a whole lot of research or conservation interest in the landscape. So our opportunistic study design, especially in the early stages, was well suited to address very fundamental research questions, such as confirming tiger presence, understanding what prey species, and in this case, what factors are important for their conservation. And those early results provided justification for requests for funding, improving access to resources such as camera traps for further studies, and training personnel in advanced survey methods like capture-recapture analysis. And so this improved the extent of surveys. It allowed for more rigorous survey methods such as estimating tiger density, population density, enabled crucial investments in enforcement, patrol-based monitoring, community outreach. It really helped to establish the importance of the site, which is now being recognized more by the research community and the Thai government, which have now established a permanent research station there. And Freeland, with whom I worked, applied this approach to other areas in Western Thailand, which also had very little to no research. And they're now documenting tigers in those protected areas as well, where there's no previous records. They're documenting dispersal from core areas elsewhere in Thailand to across the border into Myanmar. And as in DPKY, this is attracting more attention. And so it's providing opportunities for more funding to better understand these populations. And so I think it's important that these kinds of assessments can be useful, even if more rigorous studies are ideal. You may have a hard time raising funds and providing justification for more rigorous studies if evidence of species presence in an area is lacking. So these can also help you identify key areas of conservation priority. So there was discussion potentially of opening up a decommissioned road that runs right through the center of the complex and into key tiger habitat. And our survey results had established the importance of this site, which was cited by UNESCO in their recommendation to Thailand not to consider these kinds of proposals. I think this reinforces the importance of studies like this in understudied areas. Ultimately, I think, and I hope that information will be helpful in guiding conservation policy in DPKY in the future. So as I mentioned earlier, I published a few related publications over the past year that might be of interest. The first paper is one I discussed today, which is in the journal Animal Conservation. The second describes survey results more broadly, and that's in Oryx. The third discusses using simulations to inform study design to estimate tiger population density at the site, which is in biological conservation. The fourth should be out in landscape ecology soon, which goes more into detail about the environmental model I described. And lastly, I just submitted a paper on which uses temporally dynamic simulations of population connectivity to evaluate model sensitivity to certain factors and understanding the dispersal potential of DPKY's tigers to areas in which they were extirpated. I'm hoping that'll be accepted soon, since that's an interesting paper as well. This was a very long study. There was quite a few organizations involved that I think are worth mentioning. Freeland Foundation, with whom I worked, was the main implementing agency in partnership with Thailand's Department of National Parks. We also partnered with Panthera for the latter part of the study period. And the work would not have been possible without support from those organizations, so I think they're worth mentioning.